When the leader of the free world threatens to go guns a-blazing into an African oil giant, the entire world stops to ask, what is the true price of religious freedom?
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really trying to cut through the noise surrounding the security crisis in Nigeria. We've got a stack of sources here, official White House releases, statements from U.S. lawmakers, but also, importantly, investigative reports that push back hard on the reasons given for America's, well, pretty aggressive new stance. Our mission today, it's pretty straightforward, understanding this fierce battle between two completely different stories. Is Christianity really facing an existential threat in Nigeria, making threats of U.S. military action seem necessary? Or is what's happening actually a much more tangled, complex crisis? About governance, about resources, about economics. And the news hook here is, well, it's immediate. And it's intense. October 31st, 2025, President Trump puts Nigeria back on the list, the country of particular concern, or CPC list. Why? Severe violations of religious freedom, he said it point blank. Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria.
And he blamed radical Islamists for, quote, mass slaughter.
Yeah, and that wasn't just talk. That language immediately turned into, well, real threats. The president didn't just, issue a statement. He actually told the Department of War, that's Defense, to prepare for possible action. He threatened to cut off all aid. And he even floated the idea of going in guns a-blazing to, and this is another quote, wipe out the Islamic terrorists.
Wow, I mean, that's a huge escalation. It really signals a strong commitment to framing the conflict in this very specific way. And our sources show this move has got serious backing at home, right? Lawmakers like House Appropriations Chair Tom Cole, Senator Ted Cruz, they jumped right in, praising the action.
Oh, absolutely. They framed it as a key part of the America First agenda. Their argument: defending persecuted Christians isn't just nice, it's a, quote, moral duty and a vital American interest.
So it's about protecting Christians abroad, but also something else.
Well, yes. The sources are pretty blunt about this. It's heavily driven by domestic politics. The designation, the tough talk, it's designed to fire up the U.S. evangelical base, the right-wing Christian groups. It's all about upholding religious liberty. And they often bring up that claim, you hear it a lot, that Nigeria is the most dangerous nation on earth to follow Christ. Whether that's fully accurate or not, it's powerful politically. It's basically political mobilization presented as humanitarian concern.
Okay, so let's stick with this first narrative for a bit. The case for intervention seen through this political and ideological lens. The main claim is simple. Christians are being slaughtered en masse by radical Islamic terrorists, so the U.S. has to act decisively, maybe even militarily. Why this push for such a simple story?
Well, simplicity works in politics, doesn't it? The number one goal seems to be energizing that specific voter base back home. But it's also strategic. That guns a-blazing rhetoric. Critics we look at see it less as a serious military plan and more as a blunt instrument of political coercion. It's about using the threat of force to get what you want. It's not necessarily about actually invading.
And some critics we read point to history here. They say this kind of talk about, high-minded humanitarian reasons sometimes ends up being cover for other motives, especially in resource-rich areas.
Exactly. Some analysis points right to that pattern. Humanitarian intervention being used as political cover. And Nigeria is a major oil producer. So, yeah, critics immediately ask, is this focus on terrorism? Maybe, just maybe, a convenient justification for gaining geopolitical leverage, or even, down the line, securing access to resources, a potential resource grab, as they call it.
Okay, and then there's this other layer, which is, frankly, pretty controversial in some of the analysis we saw, an allegation that this whole narrative, the Christian genocide claim, is being used for wider ideological reasons, something even connected to the Middle East.
It's a really charged claim, yeah. But it's out there in the sources, so we need to understand it. Some critics argue this narrative is being pushed globally to provide, quote, ideological cover for Zionism. The idea is, if you constantly highlight supposed mass persecution of Christians by Muslims in Africa.
How does that connect? What's the false moral equivalence they talk about?
The argument is it creates a distraction, a false moral equivalence.
Yeah.
By focusing the world's attention on what they portray as the prime example of religious persecution, Christians being killed by Muslims in Nigeria, it supposedly makes it harder for critics of, say, Israeli policies to gain traction. It shifts the focus, potentially deflecting criticism by painting a picture of widespread religious conflict driven primarily by Muslims elsewhere. It's presented as a way to provide a kind of global ideological shield.
That really lays bare the political stakes. So we have this very clear, very high-stakes narrative. It's driven by U.S. domestic politics, by geopolitical strategy, maybe even these wider ideological goals. But now, Now we have to look at the other side, the data, the reality on the ground in Nigeria. And this is where things get, well, complicated, where the narrative seems to clash hard with the facts.
It really does. The complexity is, frankly, staggering. You look at crisis monitoring groups, independent analysts on the ground, they flat out reject the Christian genocide label. They call it things like a profound falsehood, a deliberate distortion.
Yeah.
And crucially, they point out the violence just doesn't meet the actual legal definition of genocide. That requires intent to destroy a specific group.
And they have stats to back this up. Because the rhetoric is so strong, you'd expect the numbers.
You would, but they're startlingly different. Let's talk victim demographics. Christians make up about half of Nigeria's population, right? Roughly. But ACLD, that's the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, a really respected source. Their data shows that violence where Christians are targeted specifically because they are Christian accounts for only about 5% of all reported attacks on civilians.
Wait, say that again? Only 5%.
5%. It's a number that completely changes the frame. The entire justification for threatening military action, this narrative of an existential threat to Christianity, it seems built on something that accounts for only 5% of targeted civilian violence based purely on religious identity.
That just throws the whole political claim way off balance, 5%.
It's probably the single most crucial piece of data in this whole deep dive. And what's more, the data consistently shows that the majority of victims, the main targets of groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP, the Islamic State West African province, the majority have actually been Muslims.
So these Islamist groups, they're killing mostly other Muslims.
Exactly, because they view any Muslims who reject their extreme ideology as apostates, as traitors to the faith, so they become legitimate targets. And since the insurgency is mostly concentrated in the north, which is majority Muslim, well, the people caught in the middle, the primary victims, are overwhelmingly local Muslims.
Okay, so if it's not mainly a religious war, if the violence is hitting everyone, especially Muslims, what is driving this chaos? What are the real root causes, according to these analysts?
They insist it's a mix, a mosaic, really, rooted in deep socioeconomic problems and failures of governance. Take the Middle Belt region, for example. You see these intense conflicts between farmers and herders, but it's not really about ancient religious hatreds. It's described as a desperate fight over resources that are just disappearing. Land, water, things made worse by climate change, by population pressures.
So the religious identities are there, but the conflict is really about survival, economics, the environment.
Precisely. It often involves Fulani herders, who are mostly Muslim, needing grazing land, clashing with farming communities, who are often Christian. But the drivers are often ethnic, economic, land-based. A resource war, essentially, not primarily a holy war. The religious difference might make it easier to mobilize, but it's not the core reason for the fight itself.
And then you mentioned the Northwest. That's different again.
Yeah, the Northwest is described almost universally as being dominated by something else entirely: banditry, mass kidnappings for ransom, cattle rustling on a huge scale. Analysts just call it pure economic violence. It's carried out by heavily armed criminal gangs, and they hit everyone. Christian, Muslim, doesn't matter. With brutal impartiality is a phrase you see. The real engine across all these regions seems to be a collapsing economy pushing desperate people towards crime and violence.
And how does the Nigerian government react to all this? The CPC designation, the guns a-blazing talk from the U.S.?
Well, their position is pretty clear. It's about sovereignty. They strongly reject being labeled as religiously intolerant. They argue, look, our security problems driven by bandits, by resource conflicts, they hit people of all faiths all across the country. And they see these external threats, especially military ones, as a completely unacceptable violation of their national sovereignty.
So bringing this all together, what really stands out is this massive disconnect. You've got the internal reality in Nigeria, incredibly complex, involving governance failure, resource wars, sheer criminality. And then you have this external lens, mainly from the U.S. political context, simplifying everything down to a religious battle.
That's the core conflict of narratives, isn't it?
Yeah.
The synthesis is really about that political calculation, the decision to use the CPC designation, the harsh rhetoric it appears driven by a strategic need to energize a domestic U.S. base, using the very powerful, very emotional issue of Christian persecution. And this happens even though the available data suggests the violence is much more indiscriminate and has deeper non-religious roots.
And the analysts we read suggest this simplification isn't just inaccurate, it could actually be harmful on the ground.
Yes, genuinely dangerous. That powerful, simple Christian genocide narrative, even if politically useful elsewhere, it hides the real complex causes of the violence. the resource scarcity, the economic collapse.
Yeah.
And by ignoring those root causes, it can actually undermine the vital work being done, locally interfaith dialogue, peace-building efforts. These are the only things that might offer a sustainable way out, but they get drowned out by this imposed divisive external framework. So this deep dive really forces us, I think, to confront how these international crises get translated, maybe even distorted, for political purposes. You've got this strong, simple story, religious persecution, clashing head-on with a messy, complex reality on the ground involving scarce resources, economic desperation, and violence that hits everyone.
Yeah, the sources almost paint a picture like two different groups looking at the same dense, tangled forest. One group standing outside, just scanning for one particular flag. They recognize the religious persecution flag because waving that flag helps them rally their friends back home. But the other group, the ones actually living in the forest, they're trying to map the whole thing, the dried up rivers, the areas where the bandits roam, the failing farms, the whole complex ecosystem. So for you listening to this, it really raises a crucial question, doesn't it? When you encounter news about these volatile international situations, how do you filter it? Are you drawn to the powerful, simple narrative, the one that maybe confirms what you already believe, or are you prepared to grapple with the messy, difficult data, the stuff that reveals the true, complicated, multifaceted nature of the conflict? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.